The member for Menzies.
Acting Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak on this bill and the amendments which have been moved to it, and I want to place my remarks in the context of this broader debate, because why we're discussing this bill today is because we have a government who 4 years ago took a solution and created a problem. And now, 4 years later, after more than 20,000 illegal arrivals, after some 1,000 deaths at sea, and they're just the ones that we know of, and a cost blowout of $4.7 billion, $4,700 million cost blowout, we are getting a partial reinstatement of the solution. And this is being done without any apology to this place or the people of Australia, and without any explanation as to why the policy failed. Let me remind the House that the Prime Minister is the very person who said about the Pacific solution that it was costly and unsustainable, who described it as a farce and said that it was an illusion, not a solution. So without apology and without explanation, now that which was a farce, in the Prime Minister's own previous words, is now a solution to the problem. And all this is being done with the same brazen hubris which this Prime Minister and this government has become renowned. I say it's a partial solution, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, and this goes to some of the amendments before the House. Because as Speaker after Speaker on this side of the Parliament has pointed out, that there was a suite of measures that were put in place by the Howard government in order to try and stem the flow of people arriving by leaky boat from overseas. And amongst those measures was not just the provision which is now being reinstated, namely to process people offshore at Nauru and Manus Island, but also the temporary protection visas which the predecessor to me in speaking mentioned in this debate. And it was those suite of measures, not simply the overseas processing, which led to just a trickle of people coming by boat by the last year of the Howard government, the year in which I was the Immigration Minister. And so this government is on notice in this debate that if this measure, this partial measure, does not succeed, then it's to blame. It's responsible, because it's not been prepared to reinstate the entire solution. The government that took the solution that was working, that had stopped the flow of boats and all the dangers associated with that to Australia, took that solution and created a problem, is now only partially reinstating the solution. There's a couple of things I briefly want to say in this debate, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, because this exposes two things. The first is the total lack of evidence-based policy making by this government. Whether it's in regard to this matter before the House at the moment or a range of other issues, this is a government that announces a policy proposal and then tries to find some evidence to back it up. The reality is this is a government which is not engaged in proper evidence-based policy making over a whole range of issues, and this is just one example of that. But the second thing is, which goes to the amendment moved by the opposition, is the hypocrisy on the left in Australia about these matters. Whether we're talking about boat people or global warming or same-sex unions or a host of other issues, we've been lectured and hectored by the left, the voices of the left in the Australian media and elsewhere, that only their version of morality was true and correct. And it's happened over and over again. The criticisms that they made of the member for Barara, Philip Ruddock, in relation to putting this policy in place in the first place, and generally of John Howard and the entire government. We were hectored day after day after day that somehow what we had done was immoral. Not just a disagreement in terms of what policy should be put in place, Not just a disagreement about a particular policy prescription, but in fact that this was an immoral government led by an immoral Prime Minister with immoral ministers and immoral backbenchers. That was what we were told day after day by the left in this country. Stopping the boats was immoral, as if there was no other moral principles in play. How about the moral principle in relation to exploiting people, of saying, take $10,000 US per head from you and put you on a leaky fishing boat that may or may not reach Christmas Island or Ashmore Reef? What about the morality of that? Oh no, nothing about that. That wasn't part of it. Or what about the morality of putting people on a boat knowing that the thing might leak somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean? What about the morality of that? No, nothing about that. This was simply one version of morality which was preached day after day after day by the left in Australia as if their version of the world was the only version that was true. And if you disagreed with them on this or the other matters that I spoke about earlier, whether it was global warming or now same-sex unions or whatever you want to add to that list, and there's a whole long list and I won't detain the House with the whole list, then you're a racist, or you're a bigot, or you're a homophobe, or you're a nationalist, or you're something else. The ad hominem personal attacks went on day after day after day. But what we see now in this legislation, in this debate before the Parliament, and I hear the silence, the deafening silence from the other side. At least, as the previous speaker said, the member for Fremantle had the decency and the integrity and the consistency to come in and voice her continuing concern from her perspective. But where are all the other voices on the other side, those who lectured and hectored us? All gone, all disappeared, all silent, all slunk back to their offices in this building without anything to say about this. What this exposes is the total hypocrisy of that left-wing attack over the last 4 or 5 or 6 years or 10 years in Australia. And any time again I hear someone from the left or from the other side saying that policies that are put forward on the basis of evidence somehow make us racist or bigoted or nationalistic or whatever the latest attack is, well then we can simply say, remember Nauru. Remember Nauru. Remember the policy that you said was immoral. Remember the policy that you said was a farce. Remember the policy that you said was unsustainable. And now brazenly you are embracing it. This exposes once and for all the lack of character, the lack of evidence-based policy making, and the total failure of the totalitarian impulse on the other side for their own view of the way in which this country should be run. The Australian people should never forget this incident, not simply because it's at least a partial putting back in place of a policy that worked, but because of the total exposure of the hypocrisy of the left.